A couple months ago, through word of mouth, I learned of a movie called Hundreds of Beavers. Obviously, my curiosity piqued by the title alone, I logged onto Letterboxd to learn more. What I saw there shook me to my very core. I was greeted with an image of two men dressed in cartoonishly anthropomorphized beaver costumes that were themselves dressed as Sherlock Holmes and John Watson. This inexplicable yet inexplicably captivating still was accompanied only by the tagline of the film, a terrifyingly hilarious phrase with the most chilling of implications. Hundreds, possibly thousands. It was then I knew with absolute conviction, with every fiber of my being, that I had to see this movie. Hundreds of Beavers is a 2022 snowstick comedy film directed by Mike Cheslick and written by Cheslick and Ryland Bricks and Cole Tews. In it, a man attempts to hunt hundreds, possibly thousands, of beavers in the desolate wilderness of snowbound Wisconsin. This video contains spoilers for Hundreds of Beavers. Not in a traditional sense where I spoil major details of the plot or break things down scene by scene or tell you beat by beat how the movie ends. But learning anything more about this movie than what you've already seen, to me, would constitute spoiling the experience for you. It is best to go in Hundreds of Beavers completely in the dark, totally blind. So, if any of what I've said so far sounds even remotely interesting or even slightly comedic to you, I highly recommend you give it a watch first and foremost, so you can enjoy the madness for yourself completely unsullied. It's available to rent from Amazon Prime and Apple TV for $2.99, and in my opinion, that's a sensational value for your money, especially if you're watching with a crowd or a group of people who have the same sense of humor as you. But if you're not planning to watch the film and you still want to watch the rest of this video out of some sense of morbid curiosity, you've been fairly warned. Hundreds of Beavers is a cascading series of gags and goofs that collide into one another like dominoes to compose a cinematic journey less so about the destination and more so about the specific and surreal steps taken to get there. I've tried my hardest, even in the spoilers that follow, to keep the best of them a surprise for you, but there's only so much I can do, and depriving yourself of the right to witness that magnificent chain of causality would be nothing short of a tragedy. So please, please, please go watch the movie first. So, yes, Hundreds of Beavers is a 2022 snowstick comedy film directed by Mike Cheslick and written by Cheslick and Ryland Bricks and Cole Tews. And yes, in it, a man does attempt to hunt hundreds, possibly thousands of beavers in the desolate wilderness of snowbound Wisconsin. That's one way of describing what Hundreds of Beavers is, but it also feels woefully inadequate because it's incredibly difficult to truly articulate what this movie does with what little it has and how well it does without a budget or a crew or even any spoken words whatsoever. But even then, I feel like it still does a disservice to describe Hundreds of Beavers in such ponderously weighty terms, because in spite of everything it has going on under the hood, it's such a fundamentally unpretentious film. It owes so much of its DNA to classic cartoons and silent-era slapstick, yet Hundreds of Beavers is also quintessentially modern in its construction because those earlier cinematic influences are themselves diffused through the lens of video games and internet humor. You might think that sounds like a strange sort of synthesis to ground an entire film in, but there's a method to the apparent madness of such an odd couple pairing between different artistic mediums and different artistic time periods. Director Mike Cheslick even draws a direct comparison from the dawn of film as we know it and the very first 3D platformers on the Nintendo 64. As he himself puts it in an interview with the Milwaukee Record, quote, "I've always felt there was a relationship between Buster Keaton's camera and the Mario camera, where it's very wide and locked off, showing the relationship of the character's body to this space and obstacles." It sounds weird at first, but it makes a startling amount of sense when you really think about it. Both of these different arts, video games and movies, were still in their relative nascency in the time of Keaton and Miyamoto, and both of their seminal works that paved the way for entire industries were predicated on being able to teach their respective audiences an entirely new way of looking at things, through a lens. The earliest movies were matter-of-fact recordings of trains pulling into the station. Buster Keaton flips the paradigm by showing us the camera as observer and lens as eye, a window through which the audience can glimpse a different world. You think just a train all by itself is cool? Check this out. Now there's a guy dangling out the front of it. Miyamoto, too, had no easy task. He had to teach the player how to move in 3 dimensions, which was something that had never been done before in video games. 2D Mario platforming is stable and stationary, and it does do a good job of communicating the spatial geography of the level and all its obstacles clearly from that one singular perspective. So how do you translate that simplicity into an entire 3rd dimension of complexity? Simple. You make the camera its own separate axis the player can control as they move through the world. Suddenly, the viewfinder of the camera is in your hands. Both early silent films and early platformers were revolutionary for their respective arts because they confronted the same central issue of audience perspective, albeit in different ways more pertinent to their respective mediums. Mike Cheslick, and by extension Hundreds of Beavers, sees that connection, the causal link that leads from the moving images on film to the little images we could move for ourselves with video game controllers across cathode ray tube television screens, and it revels in the similarity in the logic of video games and silent slapstick in a way that no movie ever really has before. This thing is genuinely one of a kind. You cannot, no matter how hard you try, find a movie that's even remotely close to what this thing, Hundreds of Beavers, is trying to be, and I think that's beautiful. Just for example, no joke, without any real spoilers, this movie's denouement, its big finale, its go-to credits gag to close the whole show, pays homage to the ending of Bloodsport. You know, the movie that became a bit of an internet meme for this infamous ending. And it's not just that, too. The whole of Hundreds of Beavers feels so current and fresh, and its pacing and urgency come off like they're undeniably a product of, and a direct response to, the current sugar rush that's taken popular culture by storm. Yet there's also nothing about the film that dates it. Any homages like the one I listed above are so subtle that you wouldn't even notice they were there if you didn't know what to look for. And there's no real referential humor that'll feel painfully antiquated in even so much as a few years' time. This film feels truly timeless, right on down to the effects work, which can't possibly age poorly and look unrealistic if it's already trying to look unrealistic by design, because that's the point. It's genius. It's such a 5-dimensional chess move to protect the movie from tripping over its own 2 feet, and the best part is all of that happened because Cheslick and Tooze had literally no other way to make this whole thing work in the way that it needed to. Necessity is the mother of invention, and in comparison to the stolid and stodgy studio scene, Hundreds of Beavers is an incandescent light bulb. And all of these different disparate inspirations, video games and cartoons and silent film and independent YouTube stuff, all of them combined together into this absolute heater, this Molotov cocktail of a movie to create what is, to my mind, the single greatest original American folk story of this century. A folktale, according to the lifeless dictionary definition of Merriam-Webster, is, quote, a characteristically anonymous, timeless, and placeless tale circulated orally amongst a people. Mere written words, however, do any attempted description of folklore an injustice because they fail to reflect how alive folk stories are, how deeply emblematic they are of the cultures they come from, and how representative they are of the hopes and dreams of the average, ordinary people who keep them alive through recitation. Some historical folk heroes, especially the American settler and colonizer ones, and their legends, have roots in messy, morally ambiguous, unfortunately real history, but the wrinkles in their tales have been smoothed out, sanded down, and eroded away by the waves of time. Some are completely fabricated, meant to serve as the personification of progress, or industry, or manifest destiny, and in that vein, some folk tales are spiritual stories, especially those of the indigenous Americans. But all of those figures and folk heroes were originally part of an oral history of tales, and that's where Hundreds of Beavers began too, as a part of the oral tradition of tavern tall tales, a false legend unfurled by Tooze and Cheslick as they made the whole thing up on the spot, laughing as they talked over one another at the bar at the Milwaukee Film Festival back in 2018. It was the oral tradition of tale-telling that kept Hundreds of Beavers and its central folk hero alive, in script writing sessions and deliberation over storyboard beats scrawled on note cards, in explanations to family members and financial backers, in pitch meetings and convention panels, until finally the story was put to film after 2 winters worth of shooting and 2 years worth of post-production. And when it was complete at last, Hundreds of Beavers added a brand new mythical everyman, a folk hero for this modern age, to the esteemed pantheon of American tall tales. John Kayak, Nimrod. The role of Hundreds of Beavers' bumbling folk hero-to-be is played to perfection by the film's co-writer himself, Ryland Longname Twos. This adds an interesting additional layer of intrigue to the suffering of our protagonist, as every scene where John Kayak is shivering from hypothermia while naked and afraid in the snow is an outcome that Twos not only willingly consented to, but actively envisioned for himself, perhaps without truly appreciating the consequences his actions would bring while writing the script somewhere cozy and warm. After all, according to director Mike Cheslick, his co-writer, star, and longtime friend legitimately contracted Frostbite on set. Hey, wait a minute. And by set, I mean the frigid winter woodlands of small-town Wisconsin, where the film was shot on location in temperatures averaging 10 below zero, with a skeleton crew of about 6, composed mostly of friends and family, willing to work for a smoke, a song, and a dream. A dream of unwavering conviction and faith in the exploits of this zany, madcap, maniacal man. Like any good folktale, the legend of John Kayak is exactly 1/3 half true, as his creator struggles to bring him into being perfectly mirror the character's own struggles to survive. And like any good folktale, John Kayak's legend is one of hope and inspiration, some small semblance of solace for the working man to warm the hearth of the human spirit in the dead of winter with a story of survival told before the flickering flame. And that folktale, the story of Hundreds of Beavers, is of one man's journey to rise above his station. From Nimrod to Nimrod. As if you needed any more proof than that, Hundreds of Beavers even opens with a brief animated sequence set to the tune of a completely original folk song sung about our film's protagonist, written and performed by Wayne Twos and the Seafield Monsters Sextet. And yes, that is John Kayak's actual real-life dad singing his own theme song. It's actually the coolest thing ever, and tonally, it's the perfect way to set up the scene for the audience and show them what's to come by establishing this as a story of a northern Midwest folktale set in the anonymous Lake Michigan region. But more importantly, it introduces us to the particular type of folktale that John Kayak is, in part, written to be a send-up of, that being an American frontier folktale. Davy Crockett, John Henry, Paul Bunyan, Annie Oakley, even maybe Bandit from Smokey and the Bandit, yes, he counts. All these folk heroes have their own heroic folksy ballads written to commemorate and mythologize their deeds retroactively. Thanks to erosion from the sands of time, though, these depictions tend to be a bit more one-dimensional than the actual reality. John Kayak's ballad, however, gleefully goes off the deep end into the exact sort of murky waters that vintage Americana-infused, hyper-idealized heroes habitually avoided. Because, yes, John Kayak becomes a Nimrod by our story's end, but he doesn't begin our tale as a fur trapper. Rather, he is an Applejack man, and despite his success in slinging ale, he himself is seen as nothing but a lowly drunkard to boot. He is, in short, a Nimrod. His theme song, then, is a reflection of the man at the movie's start, a slightly unhinged and boorish, but cheerful alcoholic, always eager to make himself the butt of the joke if it keeps the booze flowing and the laughs coming. He is a man of meager means, modest ambition, and though he lacks sorely in intellect, he makes up for it with an extraordinarily thick skull. When his livelihood is compromised by his own inebriated incompetence, and a little interference from some furry little friends, he trades one miserable livelihood for another. Awakening in the dead of winter amidst the wilderness after having been knocked unconscious and presumably frozen in carbonite, John Kayak's only recourse is to hunt for his survival, simply for subsistence, but with no other means by which to financially support himself, and the tools of his old trade having been completely destroyed, he has no choice but to become a fur trapper by trade, too. And personally, I find the way this film fashions the historical profession of fur trapper into the stuff of folklore to be very interesting. Originally, the beaver families of Wisconsin were left largely undisturbed, only hunted on occasion by indigenous American tribes, and roasted in their entirety as a source of sustenance, a practice that European settlers hastily discouraged as soon as they learned of the value of beaver pelts. But, of course, as is customary in capitalism, if there's a market to be made, there's a corporation ready and willing to hold it captive. French, English, then Dutch companies made landfall in North America, and native populations that once hunted beaver for food were brought into the fold and forced to formally join the fur trade out of economic necessity, so they had capital with which they could barter with their own colonizers. To give you a small sliver of the industry scale at its staggering zenith, the Northwest Company, which merged with the Hudson Bay Company in 1821 to form the single largest exporter of beaver in North America, was responsible for shipping upwards of 140,000 beaver pelts a year to Europe during the heyday of its operations. Many of those pelts were sourced in and around the Great Lakes region, as even since the nascency of the fur trapping trade in the New World, the French regarded this area highly for both quantity and quality of beaver available. As you may of course already know, one of the primary uses for beaver was in the construction of fashionable waterproof beaver top hats, which were all the rage from the late 16th to mid-19th centuries. They were treated as commodity goods in Europe, treasured like family heirlooms often passed down through generations, and only collected in considerable number by the considerably well-to-do. Following the boom and bust of this long-lived fashion cycle, the fur trade was at its peak in the late 18th century to early 19th century too. Business, as they say, was booming. The life of the fur trappers who single-handedly propped up this industry of luxury, however, was hardly so glamorous. True, they may well have enjoyed a boon here or there due to the perception of their profession as conventionally masculine, but they also got a healthy dose of masculine suffering and silence for their troubles, too. In the Great Lakes area, beaver were bountiful, but the choicest of beaver furs could only be harvested in the deadly cold of winter when their coat was thickest. Prices in the early 1800s, when times were good, ranged anywhere from $2 to $4, either per pound or per pelt, with the former price per pound structure being preferable to the latter price per pelt due to the average beaver fur weighing 1¼ pounds. Granted, due to inflation, that $4 a skin was worth far more than it is today, but the more beaver the big fur companies hunted, the more its value sank, with the rising popularity of the burgeoning silk top hat trade only exacerbating matters by supplanting the demand for beaver tops. Eventually, all the good money to get in the industry was gotten, and the whole of the fur trapping industry in Wisconsin became so financially insolvent by the mid-19th century that beaver dollars of company credit had to be issued by the big fur trapping companies as payment for furs they had no idea what to do with now that beaver had fallen from fashion and silk was on the rise. An entire ecosystem was held hostage by a fashion fad on the other side of the world for hundreds of years. Trappers, though by no means innocent in perpetuating the system and cycle, paid the price for its creation right alongside the native beavers and the indigenous populations in the end, victimizing one another in silence, screams of human misery muffled by the falling snow in a desolate, far-flung locale no one in polite society cared enough to know about. Dr. Arlie William Shorger, renowned naturalist and historian, former professor of wildlife management at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and the author of the definitive account on early Wisconsin wildlife conservation, puts the predicament of a man like Jean Kayak perhaps most succinctly and beautifully of all. In a 1965 account written for the Wisconsin Academy of Sciences, Arts, and Letters, Volume 54, Issue 83, Section 12, entitled The Beaver in Early Wisconsin, Dr. Shorger humanely immortalizes the fur trapper's plight. Quote, "The Wisconsin traders in the first half of the 19th century rarely made a profit, many continuing to sink deeper into debt. Accustomed to dealing only in furs and with no other means of support, the traders accepted with resignation a fate impoverishing and inescapable." This is the essence of Hundreds of Beavers, the beating heart of its very thesis. Jean Kayak's only hope to escape from poverty is a desperate, last-ditch, harebrained scheme, an impossible dream all that keeps his spirits afloat. Jean Kayak must embark upon a singularly suicidal quest if he wishes to survive the winter. Kill hundreds, possibly thousands, of beavers. And almost immediately, to contrast with the truly grim severity of his plight, his naked body is beaten into a bloody pulp by the very first colony of beavers he is unfortunate enough to make eye contact with on his very first hunt. Because Jean Kayak is an Applejack man. He has no idea how to be a fur trapper, and now, buck naked and freezing, alone in the wilderness with no sign of civilization in sight, he has to figure out how to become a hunter without any help whatsoever. Now, if that's not the stuff folk heroes are made of, I don't know what is. Luckily, Hundreds of Beavers is a movie that plays like a video game, which means that the entire opening of the film is structured like a tutorial to teach John Kayak how to do stuff so he isn't so terrible at his new job all the time. He'd better not go picking on those beavers again until he's fully optimized his build, though. They're a tougher mid-game mob, and they definitely don't mess around. Luckily, the snow-covered hills of his spawn area make for a pretty convenient starter zone, complete with an easier early-game mob to hunt for food. Rabbits. And the rabbits are great because they also introduce the audience to the animals in this movie, more specifically to the way animals behave in this movie. They're just dudes. They're literally just dudes in bunny suits. That's a human person in a bunny suit right there, and he's not even bothering to act like he isn't. Which, again, is the point. In the process of directing their script as it was finally put to screen, Cheslick and Tooves discovered that the anthropomorphized behavior of the film's animal NPCs could be an incredibly effective sight gag all on its own. According to Tooves during an interview with both writers from the Austin Chronicle during the film's release, sometimes the guys would be in mascot outfits and say, "Do you want me to act like a bunny?" And it's like, no, it's clearly funnier if you are clearly some dude in a bunny costume. And that right there is exactly what's so beautiful about the tutorial of Hundreds of Beavers, because the truth is that it's a tutorial for us, the viewer, as the movie teaches us how to watch itself. Now, that's not to say that Hundreds of Beavers is abstract to the point of incomprehensibility, or that this is a pretentious and inaccessible film to get into, because it's intentionally crafted to be the furthest thing from pretentious or self-insistent. But it's got a lot more going on under the hood than I think most people give it credit for. The identity of this film is a fusion of so many different styles, genres, and tropes and time periods, all pulled from different sources, both archaic and current, so in order to make sure the average viewer understands the way all these different cogs slap together to make up the internal mechanisms of the engine at the heart of this movie, Hundreds of Beavers holds your hand as you dip your toes into the deep end, to give you a taste of the madness before it cranks things up a notch. This is a folktale told through the lens of a video game, with the structural spine and madcap, surrealistic logic of classic cartoons and silent slapstick. That's a lot to process, and that's why there's a tutorial. So yes, for us, this is a tutorial, but for John Kayak, Nimrod, this is more like being dropped into an open-world game with no idea of where to go, or what to do, or how to even do anything. Watching him learn by repeatedly failing to accomplish even the most basic of objectives in horrifying ways is what makes the start of this film so electric. Here, I'll give you a little example of what I'm talking about. So, John Kayak is hunting rabbits near spawn, right? But we've already established that rabbits are literally just like random dudes. So, what better way to hunt a rabbit dude than with a rabbit chick with comedically large secondary sexual characteristics made out of snow? Surely that plan ripped straight out of the classic cartoon playbook couldn't possibly backfire, right? Oh, I guess they aren't interested. Well, serves you right for assuming, John Kayak. Alright, so that didn't work. What else do rabbits like again? Carrots, of course! How about a really big carrot made out of snow instead? Note. Cones are not cylinders. Well, the carrot was the right idea, but the big one made out of snow is too cumbersome and unwieldy to provide any sort of utility in a trap. What about a carrot whittled out of wood instead? Yeah, now we're talking why. Why are you doing that? Why? Why are you doing that? Spit it out. Spit it out. Come on, spit it out. You can't eat wood, John Kayak. Why are you like this? Why are you like this? After a lot of trial and error and a lot of missing teeth, John Kayak finally has a working prototype for a rabbit snare. It's getting late and the setting of the sun is casting long, dark shadows through the trees. If he wants his supper by day's end, it's officially now or never. John Kayak's only hope is that his ridiculous contraption will function in exactly the way it needs to on the first try. Otherwise, he'll be going to bed cold and alone with an empty belly once more. Wow, that actually worked. I can't believe it. Now all he has to do is traipse back through the forest and retrieve the rabbit from the killing mechanism. Maybe he's getting better at this after all. Oh, I guess it didn't work. There's no bunny here, just a raccoon with a conspicuously bunny-shaped belly bulge in its place. That's odd. It's been a long, long day of trying and failing to catch the ever-elusive rabbits, and Jean Kayak has once more come up empty-handed. Maybe it's best to just throw in the towel and hit the hay. Tomorrow will bring another frigid and remorselessly miserable morning, after all, and he'll need to be up bright and early to get a drop on his prey. As Jean Kayak stirs fitfully in his sleep before the roaring flame, a sharp winter wind blows in from the west, threatening to extinguish his campfire and freeze him solid in his sleep. Shifting his body to the side, he rotates his frame so as to block out the wind and keep the fire lit through the night. Ah, I see. So, that's how it's gonna be, huh? Do you see what I mean about this being a tutorial for us? Not only are experiences and little moments like these wonderfully instructive, providing insight into the cartoonishly impossible rules of this world, they are also the sort of suffering that builds character for Jean Kayak. All the world is set against Jean Kayak. Every creature and critter, predator and prey alike, are predisposed against him in his hopeless fight to survive. Even the whims of the weather shift on a dime just to mess with him. His experience in the wild of the woods is so sorely lacking that all of nature feels to him like a singular monolithic entity against which he must struggle. Everything feels chaotic and random and cruel. Stuff just sorta happens to him. He stumbles around blindly in this winter wasteland, completely at the mercy of nature's whims, exposed to the elements, a victim of this cruel chain of causality to which he is bound. This entire opening of the film is so furiously paced that when I went back to rewatch the movie and take notes, I was blown away by the fact that it takes less than half an hour from beginning to end. It's just a non-stop Gatling gun of setups and payoffs, each gag building on the last, and slowly, in the process of setting up these Rube Goldberg machines for Jean Kayak to trip headfirst into, the movie is teaching the viewer how to watch it too. Like all tutorials, it's a silently brilliant way of teaching us the structural underpinning of its madcap cartoon logic. But the video game elements of Hundreds of Beavers don't end there, either. This sort of logic even extends to the colorful cast of characters that occupy this bleak, desolate, monochromatic winter world. In his bumbling and stumbling through the woods, Jean Kayak happily happens upon something heretofore unprecedented. A sight unseen, a sign of life. Smoke hovering over the trees. Following it, he finds a wooden shack, the proprietor of which is the merchant, a quest giver and shopkeeper in the style of a 19th century fur trading post proprietor. I feel like I don't even have to explain this one in video game terms because you get it. You've only just met the man, yet you've already seen him 1,000 times before. The merchant is a man whose only means of subsistence come from whatever outrageously overpriced wares he can scam Jean Kayak into buying, since all the real profits from the pelts he brings in will only funnel upstream to the big fur corporations. So, what can Jean Kayak afford? Well, not much.
Sorry, I can't give credit. Come back when you're a little, richer.
The curmudgeonly merchant of the trading post, no doubt a subservient subsidiary of the larger fur companies that dominate the region, is a shrewd and sniveling little man, and the prices for his wares could be best described as exorbitant. But despite the animosity between them, in another long-upheld tradition of classic cartoonery, Jean Kayak falls in love with the merchant's daughter, the furrier, at first sight, even though the first thing he ever sees her do is this. I get it. After getting ripped off by the merchant and watching the furrier rip a raccoon's head off to fashion him a cartoonish cap and coat to stave off hypothermia, Jean luckily happens upon a much friendlier and less intense trading partner, the native, who is pretty much the only character in the entire movie who has any sort of chill whatsoever. The merchant is ill-tempered and irate, Jean Kayak himself has rocks for brains, the furrier is a completely unhinged lunatic, and don't even get me started on the beavers. But the native is mostly just a normal guy, which makes him stand out like a sore thumb in a sea of cartoonish insanity. Well, mostly a normal guy. His horse is pretty funny looking, though. I mean, what a majestic beast. What a truly beautiful animal. Just magnificent. Look at it, folks. Jean, ever the Nimrod, is scared of the native at first, but proving his preconceived notions wrong, and rebelling against the folk stereotypes of characters like these in folk tales like this, the native kindly offers to barter with Jean, trading away invaluable pieces of his own cold-weather survival equipment to help Jean get back on his feet, in exchange for the overvalued goods he got ripped off for at the merchant's shanty. Both the native and Kayak are trappers by necessity now, after all, and in this winter world where both men are at the mercy of both the almighty Beaver and the almighty Beaver dollar, good friends are hard to come by. Now the core gameplay loop for acquiring more useful items is becoming more clear to Jean Kayak. Progress, at last, is being made. But his newly unlocked upgrades, items, and buffs are useless if he doesn't know how to use them. And for that, there's the Master Trapper, a more experienced woodsman who takes the fledgling Jean Kayak into his employ, the sort of NPC that walks you through the tutorial of the game. This enigmatic Northman allows the novice to accompany him on his hunts in order to teach him the tools of the trade. Of course, Jean Kayak will still have to pull his fair share of the weight on their expedition. Learning from the Master Trapper, Jean is basically given the fur trapper's equivalent of a video game cheat sheet, able to benefit from his experience as he falls along the trap line, almost like a noob watching someone else's Let's Play for tips and tricks to beat a level they just can't quite clear. No more is he in a world of crudely constructed ramshackle traps. Here, the game is perfectly optimized, running at peak efficiency. Under the tutelage of the Master Trapper, Jean Kayak has been given a dangerous thing: hope. He has seen a tantalizing glimpse into a world where victory against nature is actually possible. The winter might not take him yet. As Jean travels down the trap line, he silently fills in the gaps in his knowledge base, slotting the missing puzzle pieces into place as he realizes there's critical components of the game he hasn't yet seen in the tutorial starting spawn. Carrot baits rabbit, and rabbit baits raccoon, this much he knew, but the northern Midwest is home to even more varmints than the ones that populated the familiar snowy knoll back at spawn, and as he learns to appreciate the complexity of the ways in which this fascinating ecological niche is interlinked, Jean Kayak also comes to appreciate nature itself as a whole, not as a single entity with enmity set against him, not anymore. Now, Jean Kayak understands that nature is a beast of beasts, whose nature is not so dissimilar from his own. In the snow, the only thing that matters is survival. That is the nature of the beast, at the heart of nature itself. And here, now that Jean Kayak is finally prepared to face the wild, the film reintroduces us to the beaver, and introduces us to the idea of beaver as analog for man, or rather beaver as analog for the beast inherent in man. The beavers are emblematic of the rampant rise of industrialization, the ceaselessness of the barbaric onslaught of progress at any cost, the fixation on creature comforts and the amassing of material wealth, the scourge of excess and overconsumption upon which the very industry that plagues beaver kind itself was built. At this critical juncture, Jean Kayak is forced to confront the beast within himself. He must face the man he was before, and banish the demons of his past. Alcoholism, addiction, vice, and indolence, one and all, in order to become the man he may yet be. Everything about Hundreds of Beavers is crafted with this level of deliberate attention to detail and circularity of logic. Every second of its runtime is a beautifully realized ode to the countless influences that inspired it into becoming an inspiration itself. The pitch-perfect retro soundscape created by sound designer Bob Barretto, the chiptune folk fusion of Chris Ryan's original score, the heavily composited aesthetic that feels perfectly fused with the layout of a platformer, the atmosphere of the moody monochrome tree trunk shadows and stark white snow captured perfectly by cinematographer Quinn Hester, the tense, choppy chase sequence shot in handheld like a video game cutscene that completely shatters Hundreds of Beavers' deliberately static, squared-off video game style and form to create a sense of danger and unease in the frame, the final battle boss fight at the end of the movie. The boss fight? Dude, the boss fight? I didn't even get to the boss fight because it's so completely bonkers that I didn't want to spoil even so much as a single second of the film's falling act, and it's all just so good. This thing is such a singular experience that every second of its runtime oozes style and labor and love, because here, the style itself is substantive. I could go on. I really could. This video was 10,000 words long, and it's a small miracle that I managed to stop myself from writing even more and cut it back down to 8, and yet, I haven't even touched on the most unique thing of all about Hundreds of Beavers. I've alluded to it plenty of times, sure, but I've never outright said it, and I can't think of a better way to bring this video on Hundreds of Beavers to a close than to end on the story behind the legend that's 1/3 half true. The real story of Hundreds of Beavers. Because as difficult as it was for Jean Kayak himself to shoot hundreds, possibly thousands of beavers in the wilds of Lake Michigan, the act of shooting Jean Kayak shooting hundreds, possibly thousands of beavers in the wilds of Lake Michigan was even harder for the cast and crew that loved this movie into being. You might look at Hundreds of Beavers and immediately assume, just by the way it looks, that a lot of the trickiest stuff was shot on green screen, then edited after the fact with plates shot on location. And you'd be right. But what if I told you that everything in this movie that was filmed in front of a green screen was also filmed on location? Tewes and Cheslick didn't have the privilege of a nice warm studio where they could safely film all of the stupidest scenes and stunts, so instead almost all of the movie was shot in rural Wisconsin and Michigan during the winter in sub-zero temperatures as low as negative 50 degrees Fahrenheit, with only a small handful of mascot suits, suit performers, and crew capable of working behind the camera under such strenuous conditions. Ryland Tewes contracted Frostbite, one of the Beavers got a concussion, 2 cars used for the transportation of cast, crew, and camera equipment were totaled during the shooting of a sequence out on a slick patch of ice. And worst of all, that's not even the worst of it. Picture this. It's bitterly cold and pelting frozen rain in the wee small hours of the morning. You're in the middle of a desolate Milwaukee park after hours, far enough into the woods that any trace of light or infrastructure from the surrounding country club is completely obscured. There's not a soul in sight save for a few other actors dressed like cartoon animals, and the skeleton crew of 3 or so guys standing behind the camera, running and gunning guerrilla style and handheld. Your only protection from the elements is thermal underwear and whatever long johns or winter clothes you can squeeze beneath a bulky mascot suit, which has also reduced your visibility down to about a foot in front of your face. That's doubly not good, because one wrong step in the dark and you'll slip on a wet, icy rock, or come tumbling over a gnarled tree root, or a golf ball gone astray all those months ago back when you could still see the grass beneath the snow. This is a dangerous game to be playing with no sign of civilization in sight. And then, all of a sudden, there's this strange, pulsating electric thumb like tamed lightning in the air, a clap, and then the entire sky turns green. A downed power line, scarily close by and exposed to the inclement weather, has begun to arc. But you don't know that yet. You'll know it later, but not right now. Right now, the sky is green, and it might be the concussion talking, but you think the world is ending. And through it all, drill sergeant instructor of photography Quinn Hester is still rolling, still desperate to keep production on track, to see this thing across the finish line. Later, director Mike Cheslick, reflecting on that surreal night's worth of shooting, offered a very declarative statement that somehow sounds both completely unfazed and hauntingly harrowed at the exact same time. In his words, "We shot a very scary and strange fight scene in the darkened rain in Brown Deer Park. There are a million weird stories from this shoot." And that right there is the real story of Hundreds of Beavers, the story behind the story. For 2 miserable winters, this ragtag fellowship journeyed out into the rural northern Midwest, a renegade band of misfits living by the Herzog Code, determined to live and die in pursuit of that perfect shot. Every folk hero story has some basis in actual, factual reality. In truth, because a folk hero is an amalgamation of the hopes and dreams of everyday people faced with a terrible reality that they cannot bear alone. Jean Kayak was real, and his suffering was authentic. He was each and every last member of the cast and crew combined, a vessel for their pain as they toiled in the wild, lonely dark to get this movie made. But that commitment to authenticity was absolutely crucial to the making of Hundreds of Beavers because, as a folktale, it's in part a love letter to the world in which both of its writers grew up. This movie is very much of the Midwest, and at its core, the folklore of Hundreds of Beavers is an ode to the Midwestern myth, the profound isolation of rural America, the simultaneous liberation and imprisonment of one's own imagination upon those vast, empty swaths of field and snow, with the rest of its influences and illusions woven into the text like a rich, vibrant tapestry. Cheslick and Tewes were just 2 men with a dream of hundreds of beavers. And if they allowed themselves to dream really big in spite of their modest means someday, possibly thousands, too. I mentioned at the start of this tribute that Hundreds of Beavers was a 2022 snowstick comedy film. And as we already established, Cheslick and Tewes developed the idea back in 2018 at the Milwaukee Film Fest. The movie shot in the winters of 2019 and 2020, and from 2021 to 2022, Mike Cheslick was hard at work in the editing bay, tirelessly laboring over every single VFX shot in the entire film, all by his lonesome. It premiered at Fantastic Fest in Austin, Texas in 2022, and it took another 2 years on top of that to finally secure widespread distribution for Hundreds of Beavers. That's 6 years. 6 years of starving, 6 years of cold and misery, shut out by studio after studio, avenue after avenue, alley after alley. 6 years of dead ends, 6 years in the woods, 6 years of winter. 6 years with nothing but a dream and a song on which to sustain the hopes of the human soul. Hundreds of Beavers is unlike any movie you've ever seen before, and certainly unlike anything in recent memory. That's a hard thing to sell. In an age where the biggest of blockbusters, franchise tentpoles, and studio fare schlock are obsessed with sanding down rough edges and perfecting the mass production of purely universal stories, Hundreds of Beavers is painfully particular. It's so personal that it hurts, because works of art this personal, projects of this passion and adoration and a genuine love are seldom seen, because the world and the woods are unkind to the Nimrods who dare to dream. It's almost enough to break your heart that this movie so very nearly didn't get made. But it doesn't. It doesn't break your heart, because despite the overwhelming odds and in spite of all those who turned Hundreds of Beavers away back out into the cold, there were still those that opened their hearts to this strange little movie and let it into their lives, that loved it into being. It did get made after all. The woods of our world are only as cold as we are. If we let others in, if we learn to trust and lean on one another, we can make the world a warmer place for movies like Hundreds of Beavers. Because if there's anything the other prominent independent film releases of this year will teach you, it's that the most personal stories are also the ones capable of resonating on the most universal level of all. And we need stories like that, now more than ever. We need more stories from more diverse perspectives, from places near and far, from filmmakers we know like friends and ones we've never met. We need the true democratization of the cinematic medium, the one we were promised by the ceaseless advance of technology, the one we hoped smartphone cameras and YouTube videos would bring about, the one that makes the making of movies accessible to the disenfranchised and the downtrodden, to share their stories. And we need those stories, and most of all, we need more weirdos from Wisconsin making weird movies, because God do I love movies. I love them all. How can you not be romantic about movies after a movie like Hundreds of Beavers? Does that make sense? Did any of it ever? Hundreds of Beavers is a folk tale about a man named John Kayak. And in telling you the story of Hundreds of Beavers, the story of the story itself has become transformed into folklore too. Or at least I hope it has through my telling of it. I hope you get it. I really do. And I'll leave you all with this. The next time you're flying over the Midwestern United States from coast to coast in the dead of winter, and the ground below you is covered in a blemishless blanket of fresh fallen snow, slide over to the window seat and look down, because down there, in those very woods, some say the madman himself still toils, forever pushing his Sisyphusian snowball up the hill, hunting hundreds, possibly thousands of beavers. Pour out a glass of apple juice, or apple cider, or even applejack for the one and only John Kayak. A toast to Hundreds of Beavers, you beautiful, bizarre, wonderful little movie. I've said my piece. I've made my penance. I won't apologize for taking the initiative. Thank you all, from the bottom of my heart, for watching, and for entertaining the insane ramblings of a deranged madman. I'm Frostbyte Freeman, and until next time, stay frosty.